In the grand halls of the U.S. Supreme Court, where history breathes through every corner, something unusual was brewing. Judge Clarence Thomas, a man known for his quiet strength and dedication to the Constitution, found himself at the center of a storm that would shake the nation. It all started with a piece of paper, a memo leaked from a secret grand jury proceeding. This wasn't just any document. It contained explosive details about former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. The memo alleged serious misconduct during her time in office. There were claims about mishandling classified emails, questionable foreign donations linked to the Clinton Foundation, and even whispers of witness tampering. While many dismissed these accusations as politically driven drama, Judge Thomas saw them differently. To him, they appeared like puzzle pieces fitting together too perfectly to ignore. Convinced by what he believed was undeniable proof, he made a decision that no one expected. Without consulting his colleagues or seeking approval from higher authorities, Judge Thomas took drastic action. He issued an order. Hillary Clinton must be held in contempt of court and taken into custody immediately. The moment those words left his lips, federal marshals sprang into action. Within minutes, they were on their way to Clinton's home, handcuffs ready. Outside her house, cameras flashed wildly, capturing every second of the unfolding chaos. Reporters shouted questions, neighbors peeked out of windows, and social media erupted with shockwaves. But here's the twist. What seemed like a bold move for justice quickly turned into something far more complicated. As the world watched, Judge Thomas sat alone in his chambers, unaware of how deeply this decision would ripple through society. What felt right in his mind now began to feel heavier than anticipated. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him as reality set in. Little did anyone know this was only the beginning of a story that would leave everyone questioning the balance between power, accountability, and humanity. Back inside the courtroom, things weren't going smoothly either. His clerk burst into the room, visibly shaken. "Sir," she said, almost breathless, "you've caused a constitutional crisis." She handed him a pile of urgent messages. Calls from Chief Justice John Roberts and other justices flooded in, demanding answers. Outside, protests erupted across cities. Some people cheered, claiming justice was finally being served, while others condemned the move as reckless and dangerous. Members of Congress even started talking about impeaching Judge Thomas. As the noise grew louder, both outside and within the walls of the courthouse, Judge Thomas couldn't help but wonder if he'd acted too hastily. Was this really about upholding the law, or had personal feelings influenced his judgment? Memories of heated debates and ideological clashes with political figures, including Hillary Clinton herself, came rushing back. Those old emotions, buried deep inside, resurfaced, making him question whether fairness had been compromised. Sitting there, surrounded by chaos, Judge Thomas realized the enormity of what he'd done. 9 minutes had passed since he gave the order, but it felt like an eternity. For the first time in years, cracks appeared in his usually unshakable resolve. He knew then that acting so impulsively might not only cost him his career, but also destabilize the very foundation of the judicial system. His clerk returned, knocking softly on the door. "Judge Thomas," she said gently, "we need to fix this now. People are scared, angry, and we're running out of time." He nodded silently, understanding that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But one thing was clear. He had to undo the damage before it spiraled further out of control. The moment Judge Clarence Thomas issued the order to arrest Hillary Clinton, the country seemed to split wide open. News spread faster than wildfire, lighting up social media platforms and dominating every conversation. Hashtags like #FreeHillary and "Justice for All" trended globally within minutes. People were glued to their screens, watching live updates as federal marshals arrived at Clinton's home with handcuffs in hand. The scene outside her house was chaotic. Cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and neighbors stepping out of their homes to see what all the commotion was about. Supporters of Hillary Clinton gathered quickly, not just near her residence but also outside courthouses across the nation. They held signs reading "Fairness over politics" and chanted slogans demanding justice. Some even broke into tears, saying this felt like a witch hunt rather than a legal process. On the flip side, critics celebrated the move, claiming it was long overdue. They argued that accountability had finally caught up with someone they believed had skirted the rules for years. As tensions escalated, protests erupted in major cities. In some places, these demonstrations turned violent. Windows were smashed, cars overturned, and clashes between opposing groups left law enforcement scrambling to maintain order. Even members of Congress weighed in, calling emergency sessions to discuss the situation. Calls for Judge Thomas's impeachment grew louder, with lawmakers accusing him of overstepping his authority and creating a constitutional crisis. Inside the courtroom where Judge Thomas sat alone, the atmosphere was eerily quiet compared to the storm raging outside. He stared blankly at the pile of urgent messages stacked on his desk. Each one carried demands for explanations, from Chief Justice John Roberts, fellow justices, and top government officials. The pressure mounted with every passing minute. For the first time in his career, Judge Thomas felt the full weight of isolation. He realized he hadn't thought this through properly. Acting so impulsively without consulting anyone had thrown the entire system into disarray. His clerk entered the room again, visibly shaken. "Sir," she said softly, "this is getting worse by the second. Protests are spreading and people are scared. We need to do something fast." Her voice trembled as she handed him another batch of messages. One memo warned of potential violence escalating if the situation wasn't addressed immediately. Another outlined concerns from senior judges who feared the judiciary's credibility was at stake. Judge Thomas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He replayed the events leading up to his decision over and over in his mind. Had he let personal biases cloud his judgment? Was this really about seeking justice or something darker? Memories surfaced of heated debates and ideological clashes with political figures, including Hillary Clinton herself. Those old feelings, buried deep inside, now haunted him. He began to question whether fairness had been sacrificed in pursuit of vengeance. The enormity of what he'd done hit him hard. 9 minutes earlier, he'd been certain of his actions, convinced he was doing the right thing. But now doubt crept in like a shadow. He knew too late that acting so rashly might not only jeopardize his own career but also destabilize the entire judicial system. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone to call Chief Justice Roberts. It was time to face the music. Outside, the chaos continued unabated. Protesters clashed with police, journalists scrambled for interviews, and families huddled around televisions, trying to make sense of the unfolding drama. Everyone wanted answers, but none more desperately than Judge Thomas himself. As he dialed the number, he braced himself for the hardest conversation of his life. The man who once prided himself on unwavering resolve now found himself grappling with regret and uncertainty. What happened next would determine not just his fate, but the future of trust in America's institutions. The clock was ticking, and the world was watching. 9 minutes. That's all it took for Judge Clarence Thomas to realize the enormity of what he had done. Sitting alone in his chambers, surrounded by stacks of legal papers and urgent messages, he felt a weight pressing down on him that no gavel or robe could ever prepare him for. The decision he'd made impulsively, arresting Hillary Clinton, was spiraling out of control faster than he could have imagined. Outside, the nation was in chaos. Inside, his mind raced with doubt, guilt, and fear. The clerk who had been assisting him returned, her face pale and her voice trembling. "Sir," she said softly, knocking gently on the door before stepping inside. "You need to see this." She placed a tablet on his desk, showing live footage from news channels. Protesters filled the streets and cities across the country. Some carried signs supporting Hillary Clinton, while others cheered the arrest, calling it justice served. But it wasn't just peaceful demonstrations anymore. In some places, clashes between opposing groups turned violent. Cars were overturned, windows shattered, and police struggled to keep order. Judge Thomas watched silently, his heart sinking as he saw families huddled together, scared and confused. Parents held their children close, shielding them from the noise and anger. It struck him then, Not just how far-reaching his decision had become, but also how deeply personal its impact was. These weren't just headlines or hashtags. These were real people whose lives were being disrupted because of something he had set in motion. His thoughts drifted back to earlier encounters with political figures, including Hillary Clinton herself. He remembered heated debates, ideological clashes, and moments when emotions ran high. At the time, those feelings seemed justified, even necessary, in the pursuit of truth and fairness. But now, sitting here amidst the fallout, he couldn't help but wonder if those same emotions had clouded his judgment. Had he let old grudges and biases guide him instead of sticking strictly to the facts? Was this really about justice? Or had revenge crept into the equation? As the clerk stood nervously beside him, waiting for instructions, Judge Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. His head throbbed with questions. What kind of precedent was he setting? Would future judges feel emboldened to act impulsively, ignoring protocol and due process? And most importantly, how could he fix this before it caused irreparable harm? He glanced at the clock on the wall. 9 minutes. Just 9 short minutes since he'd issued the arrest warrant, yet it felt like an eternity. For the first time in decades, cracks appeared in his usually unshakable resolve. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering that maybe he wasn't as infallible as he'd always believed. Maybe he'd let his passion for the law blind him to the bigger picture, the human cost of such drastic actions. The clerk broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we need to do something. People are scared, angry, and we're running out of time." Her words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the responsibility resting on his shoulders. She handed him another document, a memo outlining concerns from senior justices and government officials. They feared not only for the stability of the judiciary but also for the trust people placed in the legal system. If nothing was done soon, that trust might crumble completely. Judge Thomas nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of the situation. He knew there was only one path forward: to undo the damage he'd caused. But how? Retracting the arrest order wouldn't magically erase the chaos already unleashed. The protests, the division, the fear, they wouldn't vanish overnight. Still, he had to try. Taking a deep breath, he picked up the phone and dialed Chief Justice John Roberts. His hands trembled slightly as he waited for the call to connect. "When?" Roberts answered. His tone was calm but firm. "Clarence," he began, skipping formalities, "what you've done is unprecedented. You've created a crisis, and we need to address it immediately." Judge Thomas listened quietly, letting the Chief Justice speak without interruption. When it was his turn, he spoke honestly, admitting his mistake. "I acted out of conviction," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "But I failed to consider the consequences. I'm prepared to resign if that's what it takes." To his surprise, Roberts didn't demand his resignation. Instead, he urged restraint and caution. "This isn't just about you anymore," Roberts reminded him. "It's about restoring faith in our institutions. We'll figure this out together, but you need to act quickly and decisively." Hanging up the phone, Judge Thomas felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't redemption. He knew that would take much longer, but it was a starting point. He turned to the clerk, who still stood anxiously nearby. "Get me a pen and paper," he instructed. "We're drafting a statement retracting the arrest order, and we're doing it now." As he began writing, his mind cleared slightly. Each word felt deliberate, each sentence carefully chosen. He acknowledged procedural errors, admitted fault, and emphasized the importance of following proper legal channels. It wasn't easy. Admitting wrongdoing never is, but it was necessary. By the time he finished, sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands ached from gripping the pen so tightly. Yet, for the first time since issuing the arrest warrant, he felt a small sense of relief. Before releasing the statement publicly, he called key members of Congress and Hillary Clinton's legal team. Negotiations unfolded rapidly behind closed doors. In exchange for dropping all charges, Clinton agreed to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations, ensuring transparency and accountability. By midnight, she walked free, flanked by lawyers and supporters vowing to fight against judicial overreach. Though tensions remained high, the immediate threat of widespread unrest subsided. Outside, protesters began dispersing, though murmurs of discontent lingered. Inside, Judge Thomas sat alone once more, staring at the empty courtroom. The battle within him raged on, but he knew he'd taken the first step toward making things right. The hours following Judge Clarence Thomas's decision to retract the arrest order were a whirlwind of activity. Behind closed doors, frantic negotiations unfolded as top government officials and Hillary Clinton's legal team worked tirelessly to find common ground. The goal was clear: prevent further chaos while addressing the concerns raised by the initial allegations. It wasn't going to be easy, but everyone involved knew that compromise was the only way forward. In exchange for dropping all charges, Clinton agreed to cooperate fully with ongoing investigations. This meant opening up her records, providing testimony where needed, and ensuring transparency in every step of the process. For her part, Clinton walked a fine line between defending herself and acknowledging the seriousness of the situation. As she left her home late that night, flanked by lawyers and supporters, cameras captured her determined expression. She paused briefly to speak to reporters, saying, "I have always believed in accountability, and I will continue to do so. But this ordeal reminds us how fragile trust in our institutions can be, and we must work together to rebuild it." Her words struck a chord with many Americans who had watched the day's events unfold with bated breath. While some still questioned her motives, others appreciated her willingness to move past the controversy and focus on solutions. The protests outside courthouses began to die down, though scattered demonstrations lingered in certain cities. Social media buzzed with reactions, some praising Clinton for taking responsibility, others criticizing her for not addressing the allegations more directly. Meanwhile, Judge Thomas faced his own reckoning. Retracting the arrest order hadn't erased the damage he'd caused. If anything, it amplified the scrutiny on him. Calls for reform echoed throughout Washington, with lawmakers demanding stricter oversight to prevent similar incidents in the future. Some argued that the judiciary needed clearer guidelines to ensure no single judge could act unilaterally without proper checks and balances. Others pointed out systemic flaws exposed by the crisis, calling for broader discussions about ethics, fairness, and the role of personal biases in decision-making. For Judge Thomas, the days after the retraction were filled with sleepless nights and endless reflection. He spent hours alone in his chambers, poring over case files and legal texts, searching for answers. What had gone wrong? How had he let his emotions override his judgment? These questions haunted him, gnawing at his conscience like an open wound. To make matters worse, public opinion was divided. Some defended his intentions, arguing that he acted out of conviction rather than malice. Others labeled him reckless, accusing him of abusing his power and undermining the very principles he claimed to uphold. Determined to understand his missteps, Judge Thomas reached out to mentors and spiritual advisors for guidance. One conversation stood out: a meeting with a retired Supreme Court justice known for his wisdom and impartiality. Over coffee, the two men discussed the pressures of serving on the bench and the challenges of remaining objective in a polarized world. "Clarence," the elder judge said gently, "we're human. We make mistakes. What matters is what you do next. Accountability isn't just for those we judge. It's for us too." Those words resonated deeply with Judge Thomas. They reminded him that even judges aren't above reproach and that admitting fault takes courage. Inspired by the advice, he decided to take another step toward redemption. He requested a private meeting with Hillary Clinton herself, an idea that initially raised eyebrows among both his colleagues and her legal team. Why would she agree to meet with the man who had caused such turmoil? Yet to everyone's surprise, Clinton accepted the invitation, driven by curiosity and perhaps a desire to understand the motivations behind the fateful decision. Their meeting took place in a quiet conference room away from prying eyes. Both parties entered cautiously, unsure of what to expect. At first, the conversation was awkward. with long pauses and careful phrasing. But as they delved deeper into shared experiences, misunderstandings, and hopes for healing, something remarkable happened. They found common ground. Judge Thomas expressed regret for the pain his actions had caused, not just to Clinton, but to the nation. He admitted that personal biases may have clouded his judgment and vowed to learn from the experience. Clinton listened intently, her expression softening as he spoke. When it was her turn to talk, she acknowledged the frustrations and challenges of being in the public eye, constantly under scrutiny. She admitted that while she disagreed with many of the accusations against her, the incident highlighted areas where transparency and communication could improve. By the end of their discussion, mutual respect had blossomed, replacing animosity with understanding. Neither walked away fully healed, but both emerged changed, recognizing the power of humility and dialogue in bridging divides. As news of their meeting leaked to the press, reactions were mixed. Some praised the effort as a step toward reconciliation, while others dismissed it as mere optics. Regardless, the symbolism was undeniable: a judge and a former Secretary of State coming together to confront their differences head-on. It served as a reminder that even in moments of crisis, humanity has the capacity to rise above conflict. Back in his chambers, Judge Thomas reflected on the day's events. Though the weight of guilt still lingered, he felt a flicker of hope. He realized that true justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about fostering understanding, accountability, and growth. And for the first time since issuing the arrest warrant, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he could help steer the country toward healing rather than division. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Trust takes years to build and seconds to shatter. But as Judge Thomas sat there penning notes for a speech he planned to deliver soon, he knew one thing for certain: silence and denial weren't options. If there was any chance of redemption, for himself or for the institution he represented, it lay in owning his mistakes and working tirelessly to repair the damage. After all, justice wasn't just a concept written in law books. It was a living, breathing ideal shaped by the people brave enough to pursue it. Months had passed since the chaos erupted, but the memory of those turbulent days still lingered in the minds of millions. Judge Clarence Thomas found himself navigating a world that felt different, both within the hallowed halls of the Supreme Court and outside them. The public eye remained fixed on him, scrutinizing his every move, dissecting his words for signs of sincerity or regret. For Thomas, this period was one of reflection, discomfort, and ultimately, transformation. He knew he couldn't undo what had happened. The arrest order he issued, though quickly retracted, had left an indelible mark on the nation. Trust in the judiciary had been shaken, and calls for reform echoed louder than ever. Lawmakers debated measures to prevent unilateral actions by judges, while citizens demanded greater transparency in legal proceedings. Yet amidst all the noise, Thomas realized something profound: accountability starts at home. If he wanted to restore faith, not just in himself but in the system, he needed to confront his own mistakes head-on. One crisp autumn morning, Judge Thomas stood before a packed auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center. Students, professors, journalists, and curious citizens filled every seat, their eyes locked onto him as he approached the podium. The air buzzed with anticipation. What would he say? Would he defend his actions or admit fault? As he adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd, he took a deep breath. This wasn't just another speech. It was his chance to speak directly to the people whose lives he had impacted. "I stand here today not as a judge above reproach," he began, his voice steady but tinged with emotion, "but as a man who made a grave mistake." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. He recounted the events leading up to the arrest warrant, the leaked memo, the allegations against Hillary Clinton, and the overwhelming sense of conviction that drove him to act impulsively. "I believed I was doing the right thing," he continued, pausing to collect himself. "But in my haste, I failed to consider the consequences of my actions. I let personal biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." His admission sent ripples through the audience. Some nodded in understanding, others exchanged skeptical glances, but no one could deny the raw honesty in his tone. He went on to explain how the fallout unfolded, the protests, the division, the fear, and how it forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. "This experience has taught me that justice is not just about enforcing laws," he said, his voice growing firmer. "It's about fairness, balance, and humanity. Without these elements, even the noblest intentions can lead to harm." As he spoke, memories of his private meeting with Hillary Clinton came flooding back. Their conversation had been difficult yet transformative, offering glimpses of common ground where none seemed possible. He shared this story with the audience, emphasizing the importance of dialogue and humility. "We didn't agree on everything," he admitted, "but we both walked away changed. That meeting reminded me that healing begins when we choose understanding over anger." The speech lasted nearly an hour, touching on themes of accountability, vulnerability, and the fragility of trust in institutions. By the time he finished, the auditorium erupted into applause, not because everyone agreed with him, but because they recognized the courage it took to admit fault publicly. For many, his words served as a reminder that even those in positions of power are human, capable of error and growth alike. Outside the lecture hall, reactions varied widely. Supporters praised Thomas for taking responsibility, calling his speech a step toward rebuilding trust. Critics, however, remained cautious, arguing that apologies alone weren't enough to undo the damage. Social media lit up with debates, hashtags, like Justice Reimagined trending, as people weighed in on whether forgiveness should extend to figures like Thomas. Despite the mixed responses, one thing was clear. The incident had sparked a national conversation about ethics, integrity, and the role of personal biases in shaping decisions. In the weeks that followed, Judge Thomas threw himself into efforts aimed at systemic change. He collaborated with colleagues to draft proposals for judicial oversight, ensuring that no single judge could act unilaterally without proper review. He also participated in panels discussing the intersection of law and morality, using his experience as a cautionary tale. His willingness to engage openly earned him cautious respect from some quarters, though skepticism persisted among others. Yet perhaps the most significant shift occurred within Thomas himself. The ordeal had stripped away layers of pride and certainty, leaving behind a humbler, more introspective man. He spent evenings reading books on philosophy and history, seeking wisdom from those who had faced similar trials. He reached out to mentors, spiritual leaders, and even former critics, eager to learn from their perspectives. Each interaction deepened his understanding of the complexities involved in wielding power responsibly. One evening, sitting alone in his study, Thomas reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful day. The image of federal marshals arriving at Hillary Clinton's home still haunted him, a stark reminder of the ripple effects of impulsive decisions. But alongside the guilt was a newfound sense of purpose. He realized that true leadership wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about owning them, learning from them, and striving to do better. As he closed the book he'd been reading, a quote caught his eye. "The measure of a person isn't seen in their perfection, but in their ability to rise after falling." It resonated deeply, encapsulating the journey he'd embarked upon. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, fresh scrutiny, and perhaps more criticism. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had taken the first steps toward redemption, not just for himself, but for the institution he served. Though scars remained, both personal and societal, progress emerged from pain. And as Judge Clarence Thomas prepared for bed that night, he carried with him a fragile yet hopeful belief that even in the darkest moments, there lies an opportunity to grow, to heal, and to rebuild. The aftermath of Judge Clarence Thomas's speech at Georgetown University Law Center rippled through the nation like waves after a storm. It wasn't just his words that resonated, it was the vulnerability behind them. For weeks, people across America couldn't stop talking about what he'd said. News outlets replayed clips of him standing at the podium, admitting fault and sharing lessons learned. Social media buzzed with opinions, some praising his honesty, others questioning whether it was enough to make up for the chaos he'd caused. But one thing was undeniable. The conversation had shifted. For many, Thomas's story became a mirror reflecting broader issues in society. People began discussing not just the judiciary but also leadership, accountability, and the human capacity to grow from mistakes. Parents used his example to teach their children about owning up to wrongdoing. Teachers incorporated his speech into classroom debates about ethics and fairness. Even late-night talk show hosts joked about it, though their humor carried undertones of respect for a man who dared to admit he'd been wrong. But while public discourse moved forward, Judge Thomas faced the harder task of rebuilding trust within his own world, the Supreme Court. His colleagues, once skeptical of his judgment, now watched him closely. Some still harbored doubts, whispering behind closed doors about whether his apology was genuine or merely a calculated move to save face. Others, however, saw change in his demeanor. He seemed quieter, more reflective, often seeking input before making decisions. This newfound humility didn't erase the past, but it opened doors for reconciliation. One afternoon, during a routine meeting of the justices, Chief Justice John Roberts addressed the group. "We've all made mistakes," he said, glancing briefly at Thomas. "What matters is how we learn from them." The room fell silent, the weight of his words sinking in. No one mentioned Thomas by name, but everyone knew who he was referring to. After the meeting, several justices approached Thomas, offering quiet words of encouragement. These small gestures meant more to him than they could have imagined, signaling that forgiveness might be possible, even among those who had doubted him most. Outside the courthouse, life slowly returned to normal, or as close to normal as it could get after such an upheaval. Hillary Clinton continued her work, focusing on policy initiatives and speaking engagements. She rarely spoke publicly about the incident, preferring to let actions speak louder than words. Yet privately she acknowledged that the experience had changed her too. Conversations with Judge Thomas had shown her the value of listening, even when it felt uncomfortable. In interviews, she emphasized unity over division, urging Americans to focus on solutions rather than blame. Meanwhile, protests faded, replaced by community forums where citizens gathered to discuss ways to strengthen democracy. Activists pushed for reforms in the justice system, advocating for greater transparency and checks on power. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at preventing similar crises in the future. While progress was slow, the momentum built steadily, fueled by a collective desire to ensure that no single decision could destabilize the nation again. Back in his chambers, Judge Thomas found himself grappling with a new kind of pressure, not the burden of guilt, but the responsibility of redemption. Every ruling he made was scrutinized, every opinion he wrote dissected for signs of bias. At first, this level of attention weighed heavily on him, but over time, he came to see it as an opportunity, a chance to prove that he had truly changed. He poured extra effort into each case, consulting colleagues, reviewing evidence meticulously, and ensuring his decisions were grounded in law rather than emotion. His personal life also underwent transformation. Friends noticed a shift in his demeanor. He laughed more, shared stories openly, and sought connection in ways he hadn't before. One weekend, he attended a local church service, something he hadn't done in years. Sitting among strangers, listening to sermons about grace and second chances, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. It reminded him that everyone, no matter their title or position, was searching for meaning and belonging. As months turned into a year, Judge Thomas marked the anniversary of the incident quietly. Early that morning, he visited a park near his home, sitting on a bench overlooking a pond. Ducks swam lazily, leaves rustled in the breeze, and children played nearby. It struck him how ordinary the day felt, despite its significance. A year ago, he had been at the center of a national firestorm. Now he was just another person trying to do better. He reflected on the journey since then, the apologies, the meetings, the reforms, the sleepless nights. There were moments when he doubted himself, wondering if he'd ever regain the trust he'd lost. But there were also moments of hope, like when a young law student approached him after a lecture thanking him for inspiring her to pursue justice with integrity. Those small victories kept him going, reminding him that growth isn't measured in grand gestures but in daily efforts to improve. That evening he sat down to write a letter, not to anyone in particular, but to himself. "Dear Clarence," he began, smiling faintly at the formality, "you messed up big time last year. You acted out of conviction, but you forgot the human cost of your actions. Since then, you've tried to fix things, not because you had to, but because you wanted to. And while you'll never be perfect, you're learning. Keep learning." Folding the letter and placing it in a drawer, he felt lighter somehow, as if writing those words had lifted a weight off his shoulders. Tomorrow would bring challenges, criticisms, and perhaps more missteps. But tonight, he allowed himself to rest, knowing he was doing the best he could. In the end, Judge Clarence Thomas's story wasn't just about a mistake or its consequences. It was about resilience, humility, and the enduring belief that people can change. The scars of that chaotic period remained, shaping both him and the nation, but so did the lessons about the fragility of trust, the importance of dialogue, and the power of owning one's flaws. As he switched off the light and headed to bed, Judge Thomas carried with him not just regret, but hope. Hope that even in brokenness there lies the possibility of healing, and that justice, true justice, begins with acknowledging our shared humanity.